You're listening to EdTech Heroes, a podcast that looks at how teachers in today's classrooms can use technology to improve student learning. In each episode, a hero in the world of education will share their story and discuss how innovation can influence the minds of the next generation. Let's jump in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to EdTech Heroes. I'm Neff, and today's guest is Susan Rivers. Susan is Executive Director and Chief Scientist at the nonprofit iThrive Games, which aims to help educators create environments that support students' potential by giving them a voice and engaging them how they learn best, through play. Before joining the iThrive team, Susan earned her doctorate in social psychology at Yale, where she later co-founded the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Susan, welcome to EdTech Heroes.
Hi, Neff. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh man, we are happy to be here. I have to confess that my only interaction with the Ivy League was walking past Yale. So the fact that you earned your doctorate at Yale and later co-founded the Center for Emotional Intelligence is incredibly intriguing to me. So obviously your thoughts and research around emotional intelligence go way back for you. Can you tell me a little bit about how you started your research and how it's gotten you to the place that you're in now?
Sure. It's going way back. I'm older now than I was before. This was before a time that social emotional learning was really even a field, really early days of that work. And I was interested in how young children learn the words to describe their emotions. When we think about language and developing language, terms like dog or table, you can point to those and see those and feel those.
Mm-hmm.
And they're, pretty objective. But what about emotions that are happening inside of you? They're complex. Where do they live? How do you describe your bodily sensations or link those inner feeling states to things that happen, the causes outside of the person or that they're imagining? So I became really curious about how do we teach children the language of emotions to label their feelings, and discovered some research that when children don't learn to label their feelings, there's actually a whole host of challenges they experience, from lack of connection to others to inability to ask for help or understand what help they need, how to move forward. It really stymies action when we don't know what we're feeling and why. So I became super curious about that space. And fortunately, when I got to Yale, I was working with Peter Salovey, who was one of the fathers of the theory of emotional intelligence. So really started to dig into that work under his mentorship. And my work really just took off from there.
Very cool. So you start your career with this profound question: how do we describe emotion, particularly for children? And now you are the executive director of a company in the ed tech space that helps children learn through play. Tell me how you got from this kind of like academic view of things to this very pragmatic thing that is serving teachers.
Yeah, great question. I never, while I loved research, I never thought of myself as an academic, even though I was at Yale for a great number of years. I really wanted to understand how do we help young children learn about their feelings, and so started working with a social emotional learning program called Ruler. And that was about supporting teachers in integrating and using social emotional practices in their classroom, including how to label emotions, how to write about emotions, how to understand them, and how to regulate them. What was super interesting about that work was kids were really ready to learn, and it was the adults around them that had a lot of challenges. And so we spent a lot of time working with adults to help them understand even their own emotional lives, which as young people, we're often not taught, which is a huge challenge and limitation. So we developed training programs and leadership programs to work with the adults, and really began to figure it out for elementary and middle school. I worked to develop a preschool version of the social emotional learning program. And then we wanted to go up to high school. And it's a really complicated space. The structure of high school is really different. You don't have one teacher all day long. So who owns social emotional learning and instruction at the high school level? The short answer to that is everyone should, everyone needs to. It's everyone's job. It's important to every subject in high school. But teens are really savvy and they see through all adults and their good motivations and good intentions. And so we can't just take programs and activities and curriculum that we developed with elementary students in mind or even middle school students in mind. We have to really think about the teen brain. And so at this time where I was trying to think about what does social emotional learning and emotional intelligence training look like at high school, I became really curious about the teen brain. And oh my gosh, Neff, what a magnificent organ the teen brain is in the bodies that those brains live in. It is an incredible moment for development, what's happening in the teen years. And we tend to, as researchers, as educators, as parents, let's just get through the adolescent years. Let's just push through it. Oh my gosh, the angst of the teen years. But really, it's a remarkable moment of development. The brain is sucking in new information at astonishing rates. Those neural networks that young people are practicing using are growing stronger, and the ones they're not using are beginning to disappear or sort of be pruned out of use. They're open to experience in ways that are just remarkable. Their job is to understand how the world works and leave the home, leave the family, and explore and take risks. But often what we focus on are the risk-taking behaviors of teens in a really negative light, the smoking, the drinking, sex, all those kinds of things, which, yes, that does happen. And yes, we need to support young people in making good decisions around those activities. But it's also trying new things, trying on new experiences. That's really interesting and exciting. So we need to think about the body of the teen and the brain of the teen as we're developing learning experiences that really captivate and activate them and move them into their creative brains. So I started thinking about digital spaces. How can we design digital spaces that meet teens where they're at and are designed in a way that really supports them in developing their social emotional skills? And so around that time, I was invited to apply for the position at iThrive Games as their first executive director. It was a new program that had just started. And I really jumped at the chance. I was really excited to sort of play in this new space of video games and interactive digital learning spaces to see what can we do? How can we collaborate and create for teens experiences that are really meaningful and transformative?
Okay. So
tell me, sorry.
No. It was a perfect answer. So tell me a little bit about your early days at iThrive Games, where it sounds like you're marrying this idea that we have to talk to teens and think about how we're going to be able to solve for and speak to these myriad of experiences and questions that teens have. And you're also in the place where you're starting to think about what a digital space made for teens looks like. So, when you all created that first video game, that first digital space, can you describe to me what it was like for teens to get into iThrive Games for the first time? What were they doing? What were they learning? What was it like for them? And what was it like for the teachers that were supporting them?
So I would say we failed miserably the first time.
Oh,
We really did. We were creating a couple games around empathy and we're really excited about what we were creating, but we didn't invite teens in early enough. So we created games that were not interesting to them, were not appealing to them, that they basically told us, no, go back to the drawing board. And so I'm so grateful that we learned that early on, so that anytime we design something now, since then, we invite teens in. We ask them, are you interested in this? What are you interested in? We've created a co-design process where teens are part of it every single step of the way. So we present ideas with them, we come up with ideas with them, we engage them in play testing, at every stage of game design, because if we're not creating something that's interesting or relevant or useful to them, there's no point. So we bring them
Certainly.
in early on, and we bring educators in early on. So if we're creating games or learning experiences for the classroom space, educators also have to be excited and interested and able to use it.
Very cool. I love that idea. So the first iteration, in your own words, is this massive failure. And I hope that between now and then, there have been some massive successes to offset that initial disappointment. Can you tell me a little bit about a successful game, one that just went off like gangbusters and educators loved it, teens loved it? What were you trying to teach teens, and what was that game like?
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time sort of dressing our wounds after that first failure, and it wasn't that massive, but it was a deep learning for us.
Sure, sure.
Really deep. I mean, it permeates to this day. But what we looked at was, we started to budget out what does it take to make a really compelling game for teens, and it takes a ton of time, years,
Hmm.
and it takes a lot of money, millions of dollars to create a game that they're going to appreciate and love and engage in. And so we started to look at what are the games that are out there that we can bring into the classroom, because we were finding some really gorgeous, compelling, emotionally rich narrative games that were already developed that weren't finding their way into classrooms.
Hmm.
So we started a process of curating a collection of games that were already available from beautiful studios like Annapurna and other independent game designers, and building curriculum around those. So we looked for games that inspired us, that we saw were appealing to young people, and began to think about, well, what are some lessons from this game? Like, where could we, jump off of themes or topics or ideas from this? So we often would start with a game that was compelling to us. The first one we did was with a game called What Remains of Edith Finch, which is just this gorgeous narrative game, really rich storytelling. It's a mystery. You're walking in the shoes of Edith as you're exploring the mansion, which tells the story of her life and all of her ancestors. And we were looking at what are the milestones of the teen years? What are the developmental tasks of being a teenager? And we kept coming back to this idea of identity. So as teens are exploring who they are with their friends, who they are with their family, who they want to be in the world. They're trying on different identities. They're right now, which is not true in my time, but now teens, they have a public presence, they have a social media presence. And so that struggle of who am I and integrating their various perspectives of identity is a big task of adolescence.
Hmm.
It's huge. And it's often not focused on in high school education. There's certainly some teachers who do, but it's not part of a core curriculum. But narrative storytelling is often in English literature, creative writing. And so what we did was, this game is super inspiring. It's really beautiful. It's so rich. We love the idea of identity. We know that really matters for adolescent development. And narrative storytelling is a core curricular standard learning goal
Hmm.
for high school English language arts. And so we basically smushed those things together to create a curriculum. And so we have a multi-day curriculum that we've prepared for teachers, that we wove into it all of the social emotional learning best practices that we know, ways to pull in those narrative learning standards that are coming from ELA, national and state standards, and then this game. And so we're supporting teachers in using the game as text and unpacking it and weaving into it conversations about identity and the world and how we make sense of who we are and what our public identity is and what our private identity is. And the feedback we got in the creation of that, and we worked with educators to create that,
Hmm.
was just astonishing. So teachers were telling us that it was one of the first times they really got to know deeply the students in their classroom, the kinds of conversations they were having about their inner emotional lives, their understanding of social relationships was unmatched from other things that they do in their programming. And there's something really interesting about games, Neff, that I think is really important to point out. When we approach a game, we sort of have an expectation that it's going to be fun, or that it's going to be different,
Mm-hmm.
that it's going to be engaging. And so we step into that sort of creative part of our brain where we're open to discovery, where we're curious, where we're ready to have fun. And that actually is a better space for you to be in, to learn and to engage and to be open to connection. And so we're leveraging that aspect of games and choosing games to work with because it gets students ready to learn. It it activates their brain to be engaged in whatever learning is put in front of them and to be part of the process of unpacking the learning. And so that's one of the secret powers of games that I think is just so incredibly exciting, and really want to encourage teachers to think about how to use games more in their classrooms.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so excited that you answered the question that way because I think that there are probably dozens or hundreds of users who are listening to us have this conversation and they want to learn more about their students emotionally. They want to talk about social emotional learning. But in the back of their minds, they're saying, but what about the standards that I have to teach? What about when my principal walks into my classroom, if he sees my students playing a game that has nothing to do with my pacing guide or with the test at the end of the year, then I'm in trouble, right? And I think that you just created this way for teachers to be able to marry what they need to do, something like narrative writing, with
Mhm.
things that allow them to establish these deeper connections with their students.
Yeah.
And I think that we all know that deeper connections with students lead to more powerful learning. But we say, okay, I know that on the surface, but how do I establish those relationships in a way that feels authentic
Yeah.
and feels real, right? Like nobody wants to walk up to their kids and start to have this like really fabricated conversation. To your point, they're going to see right through that, right?
Right. And game, carefully selecting games that have rich narrative, you can start to talk about the character just like a good book. But what's interesting
Hmm.
about a game is you're interacting with it. So it's inviting to the students to engage with. There's agency there. You get to direct how fast or how slow you go. So it creates a deeper, more sensorial engagement than just a textbook or a novel would. But you can start to talk about some of those emotional things through the lens of the characters or through the lens of the storytelling
Mm-hmm.
or the music or the imagery that brings you into those deeper conversations about self, about discovery. That is really authentic because you're trying to uncover, well, what's the motivation of this character? What are they discovering? How do you think they feel about it?
Ah, I love that. And I would imagine that there are students who engage in this curriculum who start to uncover things about themselves, right? Like
It's
if we were to say, hey, are you going through a gender identity crisis? Or are you starting to grapple with what your sexual orientation is? Or any of those things that are really, really big identity markers. They might not even realize that they're starting to think about that, but being able to see that played out in a character that they can divorce themselves from
yes.
is bananas, right? Because you're like, wait, I feel this. This character that I'm manipulating is actually, in some part, experiencing the same things that I am.
Yeah, it creates that human connection and that sense of deep
Hmm.
for others. So on our website, we are creating these curriculum and they're available for download for free. You just need to put your name in and download it, and you'll get the full PDF of the curriculum. We have some of the games that we've selected. The studios have been incredibly generous to give us some free licenses that we are sharing with educators who want to use them. And it's really exciting to see teachers really grab hold of it and to engage with students in these ways. And it creates, I don't know, I see sparks in educators who are like, wow, I didn't think I could do this. And it's really changing perspective on what's possible in the classroom.
For sure. And let's talk about that. So, on this podcast, we like to say that you don't go from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. unless you have a Maserati, and we don't, right?
Right.
So, for folks who are looking to get started with social emotional learning and starting to incorporate play into their classrooms at any level, whether we're talking about a kindergarten teacher or a high school teacher, how do they start? Like, talk to me about having your students play the very first game. What does that look like? Like, what are some best practices to make sure that that goes well?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's really how we designed our curricular units for the iThrive curriculum, which is the game-based units, pulling those games off the shelf and integrating them. And then also for the simulation platform that we've developed, which I can share a little bit more about, we created teacher guides for how to do it. And so a great way to start doing it is try one of our units, because we've built in there, we're pointing out to you how we selected the game, how we created the curriculum. And so you can follow the structure that we created for you. And as you're doing it, you're also learning and developing your own skills and awareness for how to do it yourself. Right. So continue using our stuff, but then look for your own game. And, you can see the components that we've put in and begin to apply it for a game that's sparking for you that you want to bring to your students. So I have that in mind, which maybe isn't a great business decision to give away all of our secrets, but my goal is that we are sparking for educators, hey, this is possible. This could really transform what's happening in my class, what's happening for my students, and how engaged they are in learning. That's my end goal, is to create that transformation for educators, for students, so that the learning in the classroom is so deep, so engaged that it's really transformative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that, right? Of saying, hey, let's get started free so that it is no risk for teachers
Mhm.
and allows them to experience that joy early. In lots of ways, that's the decision that we've made here at Screencastify, right? We have free products and we want anybody to use them. We want people to use them very often because we want everybody to experience what video learning opens up in classrooms. So, one of the other things that we care a lot about here at Screencastify, and it sounds like the same is true at iThrive Games, is student engagement and authentic learning.
Mhm.
I can see your face light up and I hear it in your voice when you talk about when students start to have fun and really engage in learning in a healthy, cool way. So, how do you cultivate that, right? Like, obviously, teachers are the vehicles of getting these games in front of students, but how do you also make sure that students have authentic experiences that get them to this really deep learning?
Yeah, it's so important. Let me talk a little bit about how we do that with our simulations, because that's really at the center of the design of that approach. So years ago, I went to see the Situation Room Experience, which is a field trip based simulation that is housed at the Presidential Library Museum. And
Mm-hmm.
students walk into that space. They're assigned roles in the president's cabinet, in the press room, and sort of this fictionalized experience. And for 75 minutes, you've never seen students more engaged in your entire life. And they're engaged in civics, learning,
Mm-hmm.
they are debating, they are giving press reports, they're giving speeches. They could have stayed there all day. And what I noticed in that experience that was set up is there was no teacher doing anything in that space. There were
Hmm.
no adults doing anything in that space. There was tech that was there to support the creation of this game, but it was all the students. The students had the power in what happened. And so
Mm-hmm.
that shifting dynamic, that shifting power dynamic of putting students in the driver's seat, they are capable, they are strong, they are creative, they are wise, they want to learn. And let's create spaces that embrace that, that support that, that spark that. So we took what we saw at the Reagan Library and we created a platform that we could deliver into every classroom in the country. So the iThrive Sim, which right now is free, so any teacher who wants to use it, contact us. We'll get you set up. You can bring it to your classroom. What this does is it's tech supported. So
Mm-hmm.
you're assigned a role. You log into the platform, you get information about who you are, what your goal is, what your motivation is, what background information you need about whatever the topic is in the simulation that you're doing. We have a media literacy one. We have one about government officials making decisions during a global pandemic, how relevant. And we have one about leading through a crisis situation as part of the executive branch of government. We have another one about global climate negotiations. And so students are getting information that's delivered to their specific role through this platform that we've created, but they have to talk to each other. So the power of the game is that they are using and need to call upon their social emotional skills and their existing knowledge to show up and engage and make it through the game. So they're negotiating, they're compromising, there's time pressure. So they're working through managing stress so they can make decisions. It's creating almost a gym for practicing the social emotional skills. And you can't phone it in, right? So it's almost like you're stepping into this magic circle of, I'm in this crisis, or I'm in this space of wanting to uncover the story that I'm covering as a reporter. And the technology helps to make that come to life. But being face to face with your classmates while you're doing that, and them relying on you for information that only you have, and you needing to rely on them for information that only they have, creates that authenticity. But because it's a game, the risk of it goes away. The kind of risk of, oh, this is me showing up as me and who I am. No, I'm playing this role. And so it creates a little more distance, as we were talking about earlier, it can be a little bit more self-protective because, oh, I'm playing this role. And so I'm a little more free to try things out. I'm a little more free to play and have fun. It creates that freedom again to discover, to experience, to express. And then you have this real connection, this memory that you're building with your classmates. That's a peak experience. So it's going to be embedded deep in your memory. And you're connecting, like you're having fun, you're having stress together, you're making decisions together. And you can remember back to that experience in later conversations to dig into and unpack what happened. How do we think about the law with this? How do we think about the government with this? How do we think about policy with this? That peak experience in that game setting really sets the stage for that deeper, authentic conversation that's happening in the moments that follow, and that debrief and sort of deepening understanding of whatever the policy or topic or media literacy, digital literacy that came up during the simulation.
For sure. And certainly not to essentialize it, but what comes to mind for me as I think through this experience, which sounds awesome, I need to get in contact with you to see if adults can play this game. But what comes to mind is that it's almost the exhilaration that you feel when you are engaged in an escape room and you do it with like your family or your friends or even your colleagues. And without even thinking about it, when that hour is up, you've learned so much about yourself and how you solve problems. You've learned how you work together with that teammate. And like you said, it is this low risk, fun way to engage in what is essentially a team building exercise on one hand, also this self-discovery mission. And when we throw in these components of civics and government, it also becomes this really intense learning exercise. I taught civics, and I can tell students until I'm blue in the face what experiences and what responsibilities the executive branch has, right? And some of that is going to stick for some of my students, but it becomes a much more sticky exercise when they're engaged in navigating a global pandemic as the president or as the executive of another country, and having to think about what can they do, what can't they do, how do they interact, right? So on so many different levels, we have this like really cool, unique learning experience.
Yes, you're going to be our spokesperson. That's exactly right.
All right, now we might have to talk offline if my boss is listening to this. Just kidding, but but certainly it sounds really amazing, and I think back to my experience in the classroom and how this would have been right on time for so many of my students. And I want to ask you a little bit about that. One of the things that is always front of mind for us here at Screencastify is how do we create learning experiences that are going to be impactful for all students? And when we say all students, we mean all. We mean English language learners, we mean students with disabilities, and anybody else who might have some challenge or exceptionality. So I'm curious, how do you all think about that at iThrive Games? And how do you make sure that this becomes learning for every single student who might appear in the classroom?
Absolutely. It's so important and it's really core to what we do at iThrive. We have a terrific partnership with the organization Ed Together, and they are experts in universal design for learning. So their team is on every project we start to help us think through what might accessibility challenges and opportunities be. They review our content, they review our games, they give us feedback. Now, I will not say that every game is perfect and fully 100% accessible to every student, but that is our goal. So we're working towards that and iterating on the games that we have and the curriculum that we have, and we're getting there. And what's interesting about, again, games and using tech to support learning, but not to replace that in the face-to-face and human interaction, is that there's so many more opportunities for accessibility. So think about a student who's a struggling reader. They can't have conversations about a text that they are supposed to have read and go deeper into character analysis and storytelling and the history of the time that's being talked about, because they can't even read the text. Doesn't mean they're not capable to have those conversations at all. But if the text is English based, hard to read or difficult to read, we've blocked that entire conversation and that deeper learning for them. What's fascinating about some of these narrative games or these simulations that we're creating is they're not always based on language. They're not based on reading. And so, or that's not the core component to access them. There's multiple places where you can access the story. So in some of these narrative games that we use, the color changes, the movement changes, the light changes. There's voiceover. There's video clips, and so you're getting the richness of narrative and character development that's not reliant specifically on being able to read. And so those access points they're just so rich. And same for the simulations and the way we've designed our activities. We always think about how can we meet the needs of all learners? What are the different ways to tap into this learning objective? Have we created multiple on-ramps for that so that at least every student learns something? The deepest amount may only be accessible to some, but at least there's variant in being able to access all of the content in some way, and in some rich way that meets students where they're at and helps to bring them along into the learning. So UDL is one of our core pillars for design.
Very cool. And I love that analogy. And I just want to sit there for a second in terms of how do we create multiple on ramps for learning, right? Like there might be some students who join us at exit one, right? They're merging onto the highway and they're there for the entire ride, right? And some might join us just before we actually exit the highway. And they aren't there for as long as some of the other students. To your point, they don't engage in learning that is as deep. But I think the question that we have to ask ourselves as educators is how do we at least get everybody on the highway?
Right.
And once we've started to answer that question, we can go back and say, okay, how do we make sure that we get as many students as humanly possible on that highway for as long as possible? And the name of the game here is progress, and it's not perfection. And we keep going and we keep iterating and we keep thinking about all of these principles of UDL until we get to a place where all of our students are included. And I love kind of this pragmatic approach to that, right? To kind of say like, we know what the end goal is, but where do we start?
Yeah.
And I think that's so important because you can get boggled down in trying to get to the end goal too quickly if you don't realize that there are all of these steps, or to your point, on ramps on the way.
And there's so much creativity that can be had in discovering and finding those out and testing those out. From assessments, so how do you build in assessments to curriculum so that it's part of the learning? So in the curriculum that we have, and even in the simulations, we're asking students all the time to reflect on what they're learning, what they're thinking about through interesting kinds of assignments that might be writing prompts or design prompts or collage kind of prompts, so that they and the educators are sort of that self-assessment and expressing of
Mm-hmm.
knowledge and understanding is part of the learning, because of course it is. It's not just something that happens at the end. Through expression, through thinking about and reflecting on what you understand about the lesson or the content is a key process of learning. And so why not build it in along the way? And again, creating those multiple ways to express what you understand and what you know and who you are as a learner in that space. So that's another key part, is it's in the access to content, the access to engagement, and then the access to that reflection and awareness building about what you know and understand to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Susan. Here at EdTech Heroes, we ask each of our heroes, of which you have officially been designated as such, for a teacher tip for listeners. So, my question for you, which I think you are uniquely poised to answer, is what are some important steps that teachers can take to design a program or a lesson that supports students' social and emotional growth? And of course, the answer is go to iThrive Games, check out their curriculum. They're going to help you out, right? But if a teacher is listening to this on their way into school today, what are some things that they can do to start the learning and to start that process?
Co-create it with your kids. So I
Okay.
am a huge proponent, fan, advocate, cheerleader for co-creation. So whenever I have an idea of something that might be interesting, I take it to my teens, whether they're the teens who live in my house or those that are part of my design studio or those that we recruit to be user testers, and say, hey, I have this question, I have this wondering. What would
Mm-hmm.
we co-create around it? How do we understand this thing? So um, I co-create with them. So we have a process that we've created, again, with that group at Ed Together, a co-design, social emotional learning infused game design practice.
Okay.
And it could be game design, it could be experience design, it could be learning design. It's the same kind of process, but it's really starting with who are you? What do you care about? So if we want to
Mm-hmm.
integrate social emotional learning into classrooms, how do students even think about what that means? What does that
Mm.
mean to them? How do they understand it? What do they want in their classroom? So my advice to teachers is ask some interesting questions that you're genuinely curious about, and then listen. Listen to what your students have to say. Think about what they have to say, and say, hey, what would it be in this classroom to create an experience that addresses or takes into consideration things that you, my students, want to learn about? Let's
Mm.
make that happen, because through design, we learn, right? So if they're curious about identity, or if they're curious about what racism is, or what, any concept, any part of the systems that they're trying to understand, to learn about it, create something that will help them learn about it. Meaning they go and find out, what does it mean to be engaged civically? What does that mean? Well, let's find that out and let's together create a lesson around that. That creation becomes the learning.
Very cool. So it sounds like you're telling me that you actually are not poised to answer that question. And the people who are poised to answer that question are the students that are going to be sitting in front of folks. And through design with them and through some really impactful conversations, we get to a place of SEL working for those students in that school, in that classroom, because the answer is going to be different across different classrooms, across different
Absolutely.
schools.
Absolutely. And then the teacher becomes the learner. And how amazing is that?
Mm, very cool. Very cool. So, how can folks learn more about you and learn more about iThrive Games?
So we try to put everything we learn to be true or of the moment on our website. So we have a
Mm,
really rich series of blogs that we try to share out everything that we're learning as we're learning it so that we're giving that away for free. We have our curriculum available for download. You can sign up to learn more about our simulation and join us and start playing. We'll give you a license to use it in your classroom and let us know how it goes, and we'll support you along the way. And then we're about to release a game design toolkit. So for teachers who want to
mm.
think about whether it's ultimately game design or some of these techniques for co-design with young people, we have over 50 activities that we're putting together. And again, we're going to release that on our website for teachers to use. And be in touch with us. What's interesting to you? What are you stuck on? What are you curious about? We want to hear from you. Join our advisory panel or shoot us your questions. We'd love to hear from you, and that will spark what we design next. And maybe we'll design it with you.
Oh man, that is awesome. To have an opportunity to be a part of that advisory panel or to be a part of some of your design consultants. So, thank you for throwing that out to listeners. Susan, I really appreciate you joining EdTech Heroes. And teachers, be sure to visit iThriveGames.org to learn more about how you can support emotional and social learning in your classroom and incorporate more play. I'm your host, Neff, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of EdTech Heroes, presented by Screencastify.